On Law Weekly today, we look at some legislations and lessons from the global pandemic, COVID-19. We have the views of a senior advocate of Nigeria, Professor Konyinsola Ajayi, also showing on the program more views from senior lawyers on virtual court proceedings, plus a recap of some of the top trending stories from the courtrooms. That's our lineup on this episode of the program. Hello and welcome. I'm Shola Shuyeli. Since the outbreak of the coronavirus in Nigeria, government at all levels have been putting in place measures including laws and regulations to contain the pandemic. But there have been criticisms in some quarters about some of the actions of some governors. The argument has been that some state executives are overreaching their constitutional powers by closing state waterways, air and land borders, as some of these measures fall within the jurisdiction of the federal government. On this week's edition of the program, I began by asking my guest, Professor Konyinsola Ajayi, if these criticisms are valid from the standpoint of law.
I think we have to consider this issue against its context, which is that of a pandemic. But first of all, let us thank God that the worst of what we thought and what pundits thought we have not seen, and pray to God that that doesn't happen. But having said so, we have to be careful. Now, bearing that in mind, what does the law say? Because at the end of the day, we must be ruled by law. And our basic law is our constitution, which itself allows for derogation or exemptions in certain circumstances. Now, I don't know that any state government has closed any airspace because they have no right to do so. I know that Governor Wike arrested pilots of Caberton, and as the public knows, Governor Wike has absolutely unusual methods, and which call to question his style. Demolishing houses for violation of his regulation. Now, I think that's absolutely unconstitutional, unforgivable, and unforgettable. But he didn't close the airport, he didn't close the airspace. What he said was that, well, you can land in the airport, but you cannot leave the airport. Now, under the law by which these governors have been issuing the regulations, the law allows state governors to act where the president has not. I know that before the president came up with his Regulation 1, Lagos State, for instance, issued a far-reaching and well-written regulation which didn't close the airports or any of the seaways, but said that the perimeter walls and perimeter grounds around the airport are Lagos State land, and he would exercise control over that area, and said that if you come from the airport, which is like a foreign country, into Lagos, then you go into quarantine. Then there are restrictions on what you do, or you go into self-isolation, which is reasonable. So that is something that the law allows them to do. Okay. But the law doesn't allow them to close borders. So in the case of Ogun State and federal government, the issue of interstate transport had come up, and the Supreme Court was clear that interstate affairs can only be regulated by the federal government. Now, what we have is that the Nigerian Governors Forum as a body all came together and all agreed that state borders should be closed. And the president, in the plenitude of his powers, agreed that this can be done.
So this makes it legal.
So, to that extent, and to the extent that these are powers being exercised under the Quarantine Act, I think it's fine. I do not know that any governor has closed any waterways because depending on where you sit, interstate waters are governed by the federal government. But Lagos State has gone to court to determine whether waters that are within a state are in the control of the federal government. I believe it has lost at the High Court. I believe the matter is still proceeding through its ways in the court, so that's neither here nor there. I personally think that in a true federal government, waters within a state should be controlled by the state government. So overall, I think it's unfortunate that we don't have a good national approach to this. The federal government issues its quarantine regulations. As far as I'm concerned, not far enough, not deep enough, not well thought through enough. They could do a lot more. So what
did you expect the federal to do with that? You said it wasn't far-reaching enough.
Yes.
What would they have done differently?
So I think the federal government, first of all, should have been driven more by what the DG of NCDC would have to say than what the politicians in cabinet and the PTF may have to say, because this is something that has to be driven by data, by science, and by evidence. And yes, it's public health, economic security, and one shouldn't dominate the other or the other. There is a fine balance that can be struck. Now, so in doing that from the very beginning, what I would expect, for instance, is that the evidence and the science and the data that we had was that Lagos is the most populous state in the country. It's commercial nerve center. It's fifth largest economy. The way we'll deal with Lagos will be such. The way we'll deal with Kano will be such. And I would have, as the governor of Lagos State, mentioned at the Emmanuel Chapel webinar on the state of states last Friday, that he would have expected the federal government to have acted a lot quicker in closing the international airport, because 60% of people that come in to the country come through there. And index came in through there. And so maybe we wouldn't have had this problem. So federal government should have done that, one. Two, federal government should have set up long ago what I would call isolation centers, not COVID hospitals. In other words, people come in, as we saw them do in Ghana. There are many hotels around the airport. Take those hotels bulk and put them there. Let them self-isolate there for 2 weeks and release them to us as they're clear. And if they're not clear, then from there they go to the hospital. I would have expected him to have thought of the courts at that time and to make sure that the courts will continue functioning. But we didn't. So our regulations weren't intelligent.
But going forward, what can we do differently? These were things that we should have done that we didn't do. But now, going forward with the handling of this pandemic, what can the federal government do better? So
what do I expect the government to do? Look at its budget. Because we have an economic epidemic, by which I mean a recession which may go into a depression. All right? Central Bank governor is trying to hold our currency. We don't know how long he's going to be able to do this. But there are other people who say he can only do it for a short while. And that, the naira will find its real level. And
so we need to start to cut out the fat.
We need to cut out all the fat. We need to face the National Assembly and say, well, guys, less than 1,000 of you earn so much money that can build us field hospitals. So, gentlemen, it's not a matter of cutting 20% or 40%. It's a matter of rethinking the whole of that exercise. All right? So what I would expect is the government to rethink its budget altogether. I'm not an economist, but if the government borrows money heavily now to create high-impact, job-creating programs, we will all benefit from it. And that's what the government should be doing. And that's one big problem, because a lot of us are worried and are fearful now about our future. Whether I would work tomorrow, whether I'll be well paid, whether inflation is going to kill me. And then we have this pandemic, which is making us sort of a bit cautious. Government needs to give us the confidence by giving the economy a boost. And it's either of two things. I would, if I were Buhari, now say, I'm going to drive the economy by education. So it's an education economy or a health economy. And I now tie everything else, or education, health economy. I tie everything to that. The roads I will build, the schools that I will build, the technology that I will deploy, the bridges that I will build, the power, right, that I will build, the waterways that I will dredge, the water that I will make, the fashion industry, the clothing industry, the entertainment industry, all is going to be tied around that. Awolowo, when he was premier, spent over 45% of his budget on education. He had an education economy. But you know what? He just didn't use it to build schools. Everything, it was what drove the economy. But then we'll all see what happened. So a stadium is part of education. So that's what I would do if I was government today.
What for you are the lessons from this pandemic for the judiciary?
Right. First lesson is that it exposed the archaic and analog nature of our courts. It exposed the fact that both bar and bench are not ready for the future.
Why you say that?
Because you listen to lawyers and they obsequiously argue that you can't have virtual hearings and that's unconstitutional. You notice the time it took the court to embrace this virtual hearing that we have, because we don't have any virtual courts at all. The third thing is that it exposed the belly of the misapplication of federalism to the judiciary. Our constitution creates our courts. The making of rules is in the constitution. It's therefore very disappointing, as Yemi Kande Johnson said in his interview with you a few days ago, that the judges seem to have exhibited a lot of lack of courage and vision in exercising their power by themselves rather than being obsequious, waiting slavishly for directions from NJC or the Chief Justice of Nigeria, when indeed they all have rules of court and nobody wrote those rules based on what NJC said. The rules of court that we see are all written by the courts. They don't wait for NJC to write those rules, do they? But anyway, so they all waited in the first instance for NJC to do this. Why can't we? The rules today allow evidence to be given by remote means, i.e. before COVID. Why can't we expand on that? Why can't we get rid of rigid rules on service of process?
Talk to us about the constitutionality of virtual courtrooms.
All right. So I think it goes back to what we were just talking about. But in a mock trial between Ogunwumiju and Senior Advocate of Nigeria before Afren, these matters were discussed, and his ruling was that it is constitutional and that we do not need to amend the Constitution. We can't amend the Constitution for everything we want to do. And I would rather a wholesale look at a constitution which is a military contraption as far as I'm concerned, and getting a constitution which is a reflection of the will of the people. Because Justice Nikki Toby, God bless his memory, sat with some people, wrote, panabated 1979 constitution, added a few things, and gave us this constitution, and immediately passed it. There's no reason why we can't have a plebiscite or an election where we appoint members to the Constituent Assembly and then they give us a constitution. But before then, what can we do? Because we must move on. So, my right to go to work, my right to go to church, my right to associate with people, my right to go to a restaurant was all taken away by a regulation. They didn't amend the Constitution. There are people that have said that thing is unconstitutional, but the courts have upheld these things. So do we need to amend the Constitution? I don't think so. Does Section 36 bar this? No. Those people that say the Constitution says public didn't say in a building. If it said so, maybe I would say, there's a problem. But it doesn't say in a building. That's the first thing. It just says public. Now, what is more public? We have this building that can seat only 50 people, and we have this platform that allows 10,000 people to watch. Is my question to my colleagues, public. So what is more important to you, my dear colleagues? 50 men and women in a room, or in a room that allows literally 200 million Nigerians to watch.